A few weeks ago, I was in Japan and I did some amazing game hunting, and I have some amazing pickups that I want to share with you guys. But before I get into it, I have to thank my wife for making this trip possible, not only convincing me to go, but also arranging large portions of it. If you've been following the channel for a while, you'll know that Japan has always been kind of a central theme here. I talk about import games, I've talked about Mahjong, I've shared a lot of that, I've reviewed a lot of those games, but I had never gone. And my wife would always ask, well, why didn't you go when you were single, or what prevented you from going over there? And for me, it was always the length of the flight, or I was traveling elsewhere for work, and then when I got back, I didn't want to travel again. So my wife works for a company over there and would always ask me to go, like, you want to come with me? And she was nice enough to arrange her most recent trip around a time when I could take off and I could join her. So without her, these pickups wouldn't have been possible. So I wound up buying 40 plus games, and I'll talk a little bit about my methodology. When I was over there, I realized that a lot of the heavy hitters, a lot of the games that we kind of have in our minds as iconic imports were priced as such. So there was really no benefit to purchasing them in Japan, except for perhaps a little discount because of the exchange rate. And also, Japan is a fascinating country. There's so much to do. I didn't want to restrict myself only to game hunting. That would have been an unfortunate use of time for an amazing trip in an amazing country. So I kind of gave myself little bits of time to find some stores and game hunt, and I interspersed those little bits of time with actual cultural exploration and doing things with my wife, who was a good sport. While I was hunting, she kind of occupy herself, and if we saw a shop or something, she would kind of let me go in there. But I decided not to look for the gems, for the heavy hitters, but instead for games that just looked interesting in genres that I like, or in genres that I thought would be fun. And I didn't put a ton of thought into it necessarily, but instead I was just trying to kind of maximize my time. So again, I think I came away pretty well with these 40-odd games that I'm going to talk about. Now, bear in mind, before we get started, I'm not going to review these games in the traditional sense. I have not played through all of them. In fact, I have not played through many of them unless it's something that I picked up that I already had. But this is just going to be my subjective first impressions of a number of interesting titles that I found on this wonderful trip. So I started off looking for PC Engine games, HuCard games, and I picked up Formation Soccer 1995. If there was ever a game that kind of highlighted the theory under which I was working, that is, find things that are interesting to me and me only, this would probably be the best example. In the 90s, Italian soccer was pretty popular. It was one of the hotter leagues in the world. And I always kind of liked these style of soccer games, sort of arcade soccer games. The one that comes to mind is Taito's, I believe it was called Hat Trick Hero. I don't know if that was the Japanese title or the US title, but it was just a fun, kind of frenetic soccer game. And this one is not quite as good as that one, but it's serviceable. It's fun. It has a voiced announcer who speaks with a stereotypical Italian accent. It's just one of those curiosity games that I've seen online for a while and never really picked up. And I think I got it for about $2 or $3. So I gave it a try. It's not something I'm going to play a lot, but I don't regret picking it up. The next game I picked up was Forgotten Worlds, and honestly, I knew nothing about this game. I saw it sort of sitting on a shelf as like an employee pick at a Mandarake in Osaka. And I had looked at it for a couple days. It was about $40 US, and it wasn't necessarily a great deal because I think it goes for around $45, $50. But after a while, it just kind of broke me down. And I'm like, hey, it's a side-scrolling shooter on the PC Engine. I should probably have this in my collection. Upon playing it, I have to say, I appreciate what it was trying to do for the time, but I wasn't a fan only because I feel like as I was going through it, I was just asking myself, boy, this would make a great twin stick shooter. I feel like control schemes have evolved to the point where something like that stands out, but you do have to take it on its own merits, and it looks good. It was innovative for the time, and I could see it being reasonably fun once I adjust myself to the controls. Then I kept on seeing arcade card CD-ROM games, and I did not own any up until this point, so I figured I'd give them a try, and the first one that I picked up was Fatal Fury Special. And as an original TurboGrafx owner, I didn't have the CD, but just owning the hardware, I could have only dreamed of playing a game like this on my home console. Now, I have to say that it is very hard. In fact, I think a lot of fighting games on the TurboGrafx PC Engine, import fighting games, are pretty difficult, but it's still fun and it's still impressive to see how it evolved and how the console got to the point of being able to play a game like this. Now, there are better versions of Fatal Fury, certainly, but this is a fun one to have for what it stands for the evolution of that system. The next arcade card game that I picked up was World Heroes 2. I've always had an interest in World Heroes, though I never really played it in any great quantities. I've played it in the arcade a few times. I have it on the Sega Saturn, and I always thought it was kind of a Street Fighter ripoff and not in a good way, but then over the years I was like, well, perhaps that was unfair. This version, again, super difficult, but technically impressive. The fact that we're seeing this on PC Engine hardware is, one of those kind of historical curiosities that's worth owning, but it really challenged me to really anticipate certain moves and certain what I would call spamming abilities that the CPU has. Nonetheless, it's fun, and I do not regret picking it up. I think it was about $25. So my one and only Hue card game was Dyson Poo, and this was another one that I kind of saw on the shelf, and my wife was like, hey, why don't you pick a game up on me? And I was looking around, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to go with this one. And I have to say, it was a very good choice. This is one of the better shmups that I've played on the PC Engine, and it's just you have this squadron of planes that you can expend at will, and it has a nice pace. It kind of moves nicely from one area to the other. It's challenging, but you get enough lives to really give it a solid go. I think perhaps back in the day it would have been seen as like a little bit amateurish compared to the other shooters on the console. But these days, I don't mind a bit of forgiveness, and I just had a great playthrough of this game. So definitely one of the highlights of the trip. I then got an itch for handheld games. And on the way to Japan, or slightly before we left for Japan, I modded my old 3DS. And one of the things you can do is play import games. Totally region unlocks the console. So I was on the lookout for some interesting Japanese DS and 3DS games. And the first one I picked up was Cube Creator DX by Arc System Works. I'd never heard of this franchise, but I like Arc System Works games, and I was like, okay, let's give this one a shot. This is essentially a Japanese Minecraft. And while it looked interesting in practice, I thought it was very difficult to play. Again, perhaps some modern gaming tendencies have rubbed off on me, but it really needed a second analog stick. And it was very, very difficult to build with the control scheme that I had. And then I was actually thinking, well, maybe I should get a Japanese new 3DS, which I eventually did for the awesome price of $80. So maybe I can go back, and now that it has the second stick, I can give it a try. I'm not a Minecraft fan, but considering that this was about $1, I figured I would give it a shot, and if I have time, I will go back to it. I then found another 3DS game about which I had heard absolutely nothing, and that is, I think it's called Pocket Soccer League Calcio Bit or something like that. And it is a soccer management RPG. Now, I've always said, especially on the podcast, when you're importing, you're always kind of looking for the game that's in the sweet spot. There's not a huge language barrier. You can pick it up and play. This really doesn't meet that criteria. It has a fairly significant language barrier, although you can kind of figure out what you need to do if you play around with it. And once you see what it's doing, it's a pretty engaging game. You're kind of building your team, you're picking your prefecture, you're drafting your players, you're setting up formations, and you're picking their training regimen, and then you're just watching short little games play out, and you can see if your decisions are panning out. Now, you can change the strategy in game from what I can tell, but the games are short enough that it's actually pretty intriguing, and I feel like if I worked through the language barrier a little bit more, I could get a lot out of it. It really does feel like the perfect on-the-go sports game. I believe it has an English release in Europe, and I'm thinking of eventually hunting that one down so that I can actually get into it, because the time that I put in was pretty rewarding, even though I only got through like the opening match or two. I could see what it was going after, and I think it's pretty cool. The next day, I picked up a Dragon Ball Z fighting game for the 3DS. Might have been about $3 or $4, but it looked interesting only because I didn't realize that there was a 2D Dragon Ball fighting game on the system. And at least from the back of the box, I was like, oh, this is reminiscent of the Dragon Ball Fighters fighting game that came out a couple of years ago for the PlayStation 4, Xbox, PC, and so forth. And when you fire it up, it does actually capture that same feeling visually as those other games. Now, I'm not a Dragon Ball fan, but I infinitely prefer the 2D fighting Dragon Balls to the kind of Bandai Namco 3D sort of free-flowing fighting games, which I think play a little sloppy for my tastes. I think this game is probably very average. It's nothing to write home about, but considering the form factor and considering the fact that it's a handheld, I think for the price it was an interesting pickup. So I had to give the DS some love on this trip, and I was excited to find Hajime no Ippo DS, The Fighting. If you remember, years and years ago, I talked about my best sports games of all time, and on that list was Victorious Boxers, and that was from the Hajime no Ippo manga and anime series. It was, I think, the best boxing game ever made. Extremely technical, extremely difficult. This game is not quite that. Uh, it's more of like a punch-out style. It's not super difficult, especially if you master the countering mechanic. But what it does pretty nicely is it incorporates a lot of touch-based training. So in between fights, you have a number of like touch-based mini games. They're all pretty fun. I mean, you consider the time period where touch controls were a novelty. So as a package, this is a pretty interesting package if you like the series. Not super heavy in the language barrier. You can figure it out. It doesn't really, again, stand up to the greats in the series, but it's enjoyable, and for a few bucks, it was a worthy pickup. I couldn't leave Japan without picking up some games for Sony's handheld consoles, and I started with the PSP. It was overwhelming how many PSP games there were at such cheap prices. PSP games, especially visual novels, are kind of like our sports games. So I saw this one, Macross Ultimate Frontier, and I figured I'd give it a shot. It was $1.50. And I have to say, it's pretty impressive for a PSP game. It has 3 different control modes. One of them is kind of like almost like an Ace Combat style. The other is, I guess, like half robot, half fighter jet, and then you have like the full-on robot combat. Each is a little bit different, but the game is fun. It's frenetic. I think it plays better than some of the more recent Bandai Namco robot shooters or mecha shooters. Although, again, this is a theme. I'm going to complain about control schemes. On the PSP, I always hated the placement of the power toggle, and this game can get pretty intense, and I found myself actually putting the console into sleep mode or turning it off. So I think this is definitely one for the PSP emulators, but I mean, for under $2, this was a pretty satisfying pickup. Next up is an interesting one. This is a game called Sunday versus Magazine, and I don't know the rest of the title, but from what I gather, this is like a mashup fighter between 2, I guess, weekly manga publications, and it's surprisingly very good. It's a 2.5D fighter, and I say that rather loosely in the sense that it plays very much like a traditional 2D fighter, but there's a dodge mechanic that it feels a little exaggerated, where you're actually kind of like moving in space behind your opponent. And from what I've played, the game really forces you to make use of this mechanic, so you kind of like time it out properly, get behind your opponent, and then string together some combos and juggling sequences. It's, like I said, very, very surprised by this one. It's an enjoyable game. It's one of those PSP games in Japan that you can pick up for under $2, and as an importer from the United States, this is a lot of fun. Again, it's another one that I would probably like to try upscaled on a PSP emulator, but it is a lot of fun, and I definitely want to get back to it, and I would definitely recommend it. The next game was a real surprise. It's called Yoma Weary, pronounced that poorly, Alone in the Dark or Lost in the Dark, something like that. Horror game, and it was relatively cheap. It was in the, I think, $18 to $22 range, and I was like, oh, horror game. It looks playable based on the back of the box, and sure enough, it was playable. It doesn't have much language at all. The premise of the game is you're a young girl, your family has disappeared, and you're being chased by demons. So sounds fairly standard, but I actually found it quite scary. I played it one night right before I was going to bed, and I was surprised by what I was seeing, what I was experiencing. You wouldn't associate some of the things that happen with kind of a cutesy looking Japanese style game, and really relies on acoustic cues and things like that. So I eventually had to put it down and was like, okay, I need to play this when I'm in a better frame of mind, but I will get back to it because it was just very atmospheric and very impressive in the horror it was able to generate. Moving on to the PlayStation 3. This game caught my eyes, Sengoku Basara 4. Only one of these games, I believe, made it to the West on the PlayStation 3. I think it was just called Sengoku Basara, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a fun action game. It played at a really great frame rate, and I remember on the PlayStation 3, it might have come out around 2010, just really enjoying it. And there were a number of releases in Japan in the series for this console generation and others. So I figured, why not? Why not give it a shot? For my recollection, it was not too text-based, although in this one, there are a lot of instructions that are barked at you by your teammates as you're kind of moving through a level, and I've found myself struggling to interpret exactly what they're asking me to do, because you do get some subtitles, but they come and go more quickly than I can capture them on Google Lens and try to figure out what the objective is. And so I've had a little bit of difficulty moving through the levels, even though the gameplay and kind of the basic structure of how you kind of take a hero into battle and kind of take out thousands of enemies, that is all the same. But I feel like I'm going to need a FAQ or an online walkthrough to see exactly what I need to do in each level. Nonetheless, cheap game, happy to have it. I then decided to pick up this Gundam game. This is Gundam Extreme versus Full Boost. Hey, I'm in Japan. Gundam is one of their all-time great franchises, so I figured, hey, why not get something Gundam? And I have to say, this one wasn't bad. This is a full-fledged arcade game. It's a little bit easier than, say, if you ever played like Another Century's Episode R, where that's, again, very much what I would consider in the Bandai Namco 3D fighter space, where there's a lot of systems and the control schemes are not as clear-cut. This felt just like a frenetic arcade battle game, and for in that genre, I thought it was pretty good. Battles can be on the short side. They are not difficult, which again I find is a plus considering my dislike of the traditional Bandai Namco fighter shooter. But it has a nice style. It runs at a good frame rate, and I don't know enough about Gundam to talk about its nostalgic appeal, but for $5, it's definitely one that I'm happy to have on the PS3, and I do intend on coming back to this and giving it more than just a cursory playthrough. So, me being me, I had to pick up a pachinko game. I've talked about pachinko games here on the channel. This is an Evangelion pachinko based on some machine that I think is still floating around, because I went into a pachinko parlor and did see a game that looked very similar to this. Not much to say. It's pachinko. It does not make a good video game. It's a curiosity. I think if you kind of get into it, it can be a little hypnotic after a while, as I assume the real machines are. I tried to play pachinko, actually, while I was over there, and the machine kept on breaking. So I was in there with my wife. She had never played pachinko, and for her it was rather boring because the machine kept breaking, and they had to send an attendant over like 5 times, so we just left. But I always saw this game on Play Asia back in the day. I always wanted to play it. It would have been a cool machine to play in person, but nothing special, and I couldn't really recommend anyone play this pachinko game, or really any pachinko game, unless, of course, you're a hardcore importer or you're just obsessed with every little nuance of Japanese culture. If that's not the case, skip the genre. And lastly, for the PlayStation 3, we have Lollipop Chainsaw Premium Edition. You know, it's funny. I saw this on the shelf for the longest time in the late 2000s, right around when it came out. And I would always walk by it in GameStop, and I would always just kind of be like, another time, another time. And why did I behave that way? Well, I have some gaming prejudices, and one of them is that I do not like zombie games, and I also don't like treasure hunting games. So I always just was like, well, I'd rather spend my money on something else. And then, of course, this became rare. And before I went to Japan, my buddy and podcasting partner, Jay Shai, was like, you know what? They're going to re-release this game, but if you can, get the original version, because it's going to have a much better soundtrack due to all of the cool licensed 80s music. So I saw this for about $25, $30, something like that, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to go for it. And it's actually not bad. I was surprised how fluid the gameplay is. It has definitely a unique aesthetic, and it's a game that I do think that I will return to. So, as always, a great pick by Jay Shai. So I'm trying to give you a rough order in which I picked up games. I had certain systems that I was searching for on certain days. But on this next day, I just kind of went for emotional favorites. And Dr. Mario is on the top of the list. I've owned Dr. Mario on the NES. Sold it, unfortunately. I'm not sure why. And I believe I had at some point the US Game Boy game, gave that one away. But I just have such pleasant memories of playing Dr. Mario as a kid. And since I got the Analog Pocket and I can play old school Game Boy games amongst others, I just wanted to pick up, I was hoping to pick up quite a few Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance games, but they turned out to be pretty expensive, and this was the only one I got, but fired it up when I got home, and it just took me back. So a purchase for no other reason other than it brings me back to being 8 years old. I then went into the Dreamcast section of this particular store, and I found Giant Graham 2000. And as a Japanese wrestling fan, this game and Virtual Pro Wrestling 2 for the N64 were kind of like the holy grails. And you could play Virtual Pro Wrestling 2 with a little modification to your N64, but playing Giant Graham 2000 was considerably more difficult. And in fact, to this day, I do not have a modded Dreamcast, but when I discovered the ability to burn GDR discs, I played Giant Graham a lot at the very outset of my kind of collecting / YouTube journey in the mid to late 2000s, and it's a wonderful game. It's almost like a Virtua Fighter arcade wrestling game, but it does have some kind of technical detail to it where you can focus in on certain parts of the body. You really have to pay attention to timing, and you just have this great cast of All Japan, and I think in this game some Noah wrestlers. So this series, I believe, started on the Saturn, actually, with Virtua Pro Wrestling. And there was a game before this, but this is seen to be the pinnacle of the series. And I always wanted to own it. I always wanted this game in my collection. I still have to play the burnt disc, but let it not be said that piracy means you'll never buy the game. No, I finally did get it, and it shall have pride of place on my shelf. And I actually do want to mod my Dreamcast eventually so that I can start importing seriously for that console. Another definite feel-good game for me is Capcom versus SNK Millennium Fight. I had the version on the original Xbox, and I remember picking it up one night when I was in graduate school, and it was relatively cheap at a GameStop, but it was covered in GameStop stickers, and I was like, I want a clean version of this game, and I really like the box art. So this was maybe $6, $7, so I figured I'll get it, and then hopefully one day, again, when I get that Dreamcast modded and ready to go, I can play the Dreamcast version, and I'm sure I will enjoy it just as much. Now, I don't have any nostalgia for this next game, and that is Dynamite Deca 2. I picked it up because before my trip, again, my buddy Jay Shy, who knows his stuff, told me, hey, if you see this game at a reasonable price, pick it up. It's a good game, and it's becoming hard to find. So I listened to him, picked it up. I know this is part of like the Die Hard trilogy, or the Die Hard series of games. So, like I said, once I can play it, I will give it a whirl. One thing I definitely noticed in Japan was that if you liked limited edition games, this was the absolute time to be over there, not only because of the amazing selection, the discounted prices, but also, again, the incredibly favorable exchange rate to the US dollar. And I discovered this special edition on the shelf. I wasn't sure what it was. I used Google Translates or the camera app, and it called this game Red Subin or something, but it's Akai Katana Shin, which is a game I actually own already on the Xbox 360. But this came in a nice little limited edition box. It has a soundtrack, and then it also came with a poster. And I was like, oh, great, cave shooters. One of my first collecting goals was to get all of the cave shooters on the Xbox 360. I have, I believe, almost all of them. I didn't have this one. And I brought it home, and I'm like, all right, I'm going to play through this again. And it was region locked, which I thought was strange because all of my other cave shooters from Japan on the Xbox 360 are easily played. And then I learned that certain games are region locked, certain games are not. This one is, but it is a classic side-scrolling shooter. Again, I've played it many times before, but I do not regret having the special edition in my collection. up next, PlayStation 4 games. And I have to say that the games that I picked up for the PlayStation 4 were not really all that exciting to me. The first one was Touhou Shinpiraku, Urban Legend in Limbo. And I saw that this was a fighting game. And of course, fighting games typically make good import games because there's very little language barrier. This is a story-driven fighting game, and it's kind of reminiscent of Astra Superstars on the Saturn in the sense that you're kind of levitating, floating, and having a battle. In this case, a traditional Japanese setting. It's not as good as Astra Superstars, and the fighting was fair, at least for the amount of time that I gave it, but it seemed like I could only control this one girl in red. And it's a fairly in-depth story mode, so I don't know if I can unlock other characters, but typically I'm not a fan of story-driven fighting games. I just want to play them as fighting games, and so when I'm limited to one character, I see that as an issue. I was less than enthused, and I don't know if I will have the stamina to work through the story to unlock the other characters, if in fact that is possible. Another miscalculation on my part was Cardfight Vanguard EX. Now, this game was extremely cheap, and I was like, okay, so we have a card battle game. Not necessarily a bad thing. I actually enjoy those games, and it looked like the interface was in English from what I could tell. However, the cards themselves and their very technical descriptions of their abilities and how they, I guess, fuse with other cards, things like that, that was all in Japanese. So I had no idea what any of the cards could do, and thus the game was pretty much unplayable. So I took a chance. It was probably $5. You can't win them all. And lastly, for the PlayStation 4, I picked up Crow's Burning Edge. And this is a long-running series. I remember playing a long time ago Crow's, I believe on the Saturn. And the Saturn version was a fighting game that was pretty interesting but felt a little off. I can't remember how, but I remember playing it and saying, oh, interesting game, but there's something about it that puts it just a notch below other beat-em-ups. And I can definitely say the same thing about this game. Interesting setting, interesting concept, bunch of delinquents fighting it out in various settings, but it felt very slow, very choppy frame rate. It actually felt quite a bit like a PlayStation 3 game, back in the day when you would hope for 60 frames per second and get a very choppy and ugly looking 30 frames per second. So that was what this game kind of left me with. There's a bit of a language barrier. It was somewhat difficult to understand the story and perhaps some of the objectives. At the end of the day, it is about the fighting, but it's not quality fighting. And I probably paid in the $15 range for this, so a little bit more expensive than other games, but I don't regret trying it out, and I might return to it if I read something about it having certain redeeming qualities. I think I might have to know more about this game to see whether I should put up with the kind of janky performance. PlayStation 2 is one of my favorite consoles of all time, so I absolutely had to search for some interesting PlayStation 2 games. And I found one in what I believe is called Elemental Garad or Galad, something like that. This looked to be a very interesting fighting game, very story-driven, and a lot of high-quality anime cutscenes. It's from Taito. So I thought this really had a lot of promise, and even some of the aesthetics are interesting. You essentially play as two characters that fuse into one, and you fight as this fused character with skills and abilities, I'm guessing, from both. I'm not familiar with the anime, but it's a pretty cool concept, and it's a cool animation at the beginning of the fights. Character models look good cell shading, but the controls, the actual fighting, it feels slow in a way that a 2D or 2.5D fighting game should not feel. You feel extremely weighted, and there's almost like an input delay due to the weight of the characters. But it does have some charm, and I could see myself sitting down with it, giving it a proper hour to 2 hour go and seeing what I can make out of it, because the aesthetics are just that strong. The next game I purchased just based on its cover. The cover looked familiar to me. I remember seeing this in a magazine somewhere, and it turned out to be Katamari Damacy 2, I believe. This one's called We Love Katamari, and it is classic Katamari Damacy. This is a game that I thought was so unique when it was released back in the day, and I probably haven't played it since the mid-2000s. So coming home and putting this in and just kind of going through a little bit of Katamari Damacy was very refreshing and very nostalgic. I then saw some fighting games, and the PlayStation 2, I think, is an underrated console for fighting games, especially if you pick up one of the Brook arcade converters or joystick converters. I forget what they're called. I think they're called Brook arcade converters. Anyway, they're these little plug-and-play devices that allow you to connect modern arcade sticks to legacy consoles. Really, really good, very minimal input lag. And so I do like to play fighting games on the PS2. And I saw Street Fighter EX3, which is a Street Fighter game that I really have not played. Maybe once a long, long time ago. But I understand why Street Fighter should be in 2D or 2.5D. This was really rough to play. Just Street Fighter does not translate into a 3D fighting game, in my opinion. And I really couldn't almost take this game seriously. It's not on the level of other classic 3D fighters, and after I played through a little bit of it, I was just like, okay, I see what they were going for, didn't succeed, and I've had enough. The next game really did succeed, and that is Street Fighter III Third Strike. Again, another game that in the Street Fighter series that was kind of lost on me. I didn't play it when it came out. I believe I got it in a compilation on the PlayStation 2 a number of years ago, played it a little bit, and for whatever reason, again, talk about gaming prejudices, there was something about this that I didn't like back then. I was like, oh, I like Street Fighter Alpha, that's my game. I don't need to play any more of them. But looking at it now, I mean, tremendous animation, incredibly fluid gameplay, music that was catchier, at least to me now, as time has moved on. And so I think this is definitely a game I'm going to spend some time with and kind of give it the respect that I think it deserves. My wife picked out this next game. It's called Fantavision, and I would guess I would call it kind of like a puzzle game. You're basically lining up different firework types, matching them and detonating them at a certain point. I haven't played it long enough to kind of go into the chain scoring system too much, but played through the first couple of stages. It's fun. It's unique. It's a game that I think is kind of a pick up and play title. Graphically, it has not aged very well. Although I believe that there were other versions of this on more modern consoles, and I can see, as a concept, it could be very, very fun on a modern platform with, in 4K, HDR, something like that. But as far as this goes, it's an interesting little game. It probably costs $3. Next up is Gundam 1 Year War. And this one is a real surprise. I got this in Osaka. We were in the Osaka version of Akihabara, and we had just kind of entered that district, and my wife turned to me and said, "Oh, I think that store has some retro games." And sure enough, they did, and they had a number of PlayStation 2 games that I had never seen. I had never seen this one on eBay, so I was kind of flipping through them and grabbed what I wanted and was kind of looking for the register. And it turned out that this was not a video game store. This was a porn store that happened to have video games out front to lure you in. But anyway, got a great deal on it. I think it was about 200 yen or 300 yen. So a couple of bucks. And it was very surprising. This game plays a lot like Virtual On for the Saturn, which I think is a good thing. Again, I don't really like the Bandai Namco fighter shooter games, but this felt very, very good. High frame rate, really fun battles. You even get, kind of like different scenarios as far as, this stage deals more with a ground battle. This is more of an aerial battle. Sometimes you get to operate sort of heavy cannons and have like an on-rail shooting section. So, I mean, for the price, this is a really, really fun game. And I know very little about Gundam. I've only ever seen the original 70s Gundam, and to me, I think that's what this is drawing on aesthetically, so that's a plus. It has authentic sounding music, so just a really, really good all-around package. Next, we have One Piece Rush Grand Battle. And this was a game that I did not enjoy, although I suspect some people may enjoy this one. I'm not familiar with One Piece, but to me this game was kind of a Power Stone-esque game. It kind of had that frenetic combat in an enclosed stage that nonetheless had some different tricks and different levels. People love Power Stone, and it's a classic. I never liked it. I never liked fighting games where there's an element of chaos and chance. I was always very, very much in the Street Fighter mold in that sense, or as far as 3D games, Virtua Fighter, Tekken. Obviously, I have not had a chance to play it with other people. I don't know to what degree it holds up as kind of like a multiplayer game like Power Stone, but it was worth the $4 or $5 I spent on it. And again, I do think if you're a fan of frenetic, crazy fighters, you may actually like this one. And lastly, this was my splurge pickup on the PlayStation 2. I got this in Super Potato, obviously famous store, although not in the Akihabara branch. I found one in another part of Tokyo called Ikebukuro, and this one cost about $55, $56, so perhaps the most expensive game that I picked up. And again, I was running a little short on time because I had some place to be. So I was like, oh, the Sunsoft collection. What a great compilation of Sunsoft games. No, there are only two games, and that's Waku Waku 7 and Galaxy Fight. Waku Waku 7 is a classic fighter, one of my favorites, and it looks and plays fabulously on the PlayStation 2, especially through the RetroTink 4K upscaler. I had it on the Saturn. I played it on MAME. This is truly the best version that I have played. And then it also has Galaxy Fight. Galaxy Fight is very, very, very difficult. I had not played Galaxy Fight before, but it's a very challenging fighting game. I could only get past the first stage, and it honestly wasn't enjoyable, but I'm happy to have a great version of Waku Waku 7. If you've been following the channel, you know that one of my absolute favorite retro consoles is the Sega Saturn. And I've gotten to the point where I've collected most of the Saturn games that I want to collect that are in the realm of affordability. There are games like Hyper Duel, which I would love to have, but I will never have because I'm just not going to pay the $800 to $1,000 that a game like that commands. So I wanted to buy Sega Saturn games over there, and by the way, if you're in Japan and you want to buy Hyper Duel, you are not getting a discount. It is as expensive there as it is here. So I was kind of looking for niche games, kind of games that were a little bit off the beaten path, and I did find a couple, and you'll see a theme here. This one is Tenchi Muyo Toku Muyo, I think. There are a number of Tenchi Muyo games on the Saturn. Tenchi Muyo is a great anime. I really enjoyed the OVA. And this is, I think, a retelling of that. Very hard to find any footage of this game or any information about it. So credit to the uploader on this one. You can look in the description and find his or her channel. But this was basically an old school FM. Well, it's not really an FMV game. It's an interactive movie game. It's kind of Japan's take on that genre. This had nostalgia for me because I did see the OVA and I did enjoy the series, but as a game, it's really nothing worth paying for. It's a curiosity, and I'm still happy to have it in my collection, but couldn't recommend it. Another Tenchi Muyo game that was more playable was Tenchi Muyo Rensa Hitsoyu, and this game is a kind of like a versus Puyo Puyo type game, although it's very forgiving with the placement of the orbs. You can kind of get the orbs anywhere near each other and score a match. It has these other icons. There's a tutorial, which, if you don't speak Japanese, is not very helpful. I find myself doing really well and then getting to a point where my opponent uses some kind of special skill or is doing something that I don't understand, and they're able to close whatever gap that I've made. I mean, I could be just about to win, and they do something and then I lose. So I've missed that part of the tutorial. I'm going to have to go into the instruction manual and use Google Translate and figure out the specifics, but puzzle games are fun, and this is definitely a unique one. I then picked up a game called Pinball Graffiti, and this was also a weird one. As a pinball game, it's visually impressive. It has very sizable sprites, and you can really zoom in on your pinball as it's traveling around the table. That's all well and good. It has a lot of input lag on the flippers. And in fact, I thought my Sega Saturn controller was breaking, and I had to try some other controllers only to realize, oh, that's the way this game is. It's not unplayable, but it's not pleasant. And then you have a story mode, which incorporates the pinball tables, but places them in a visual novel. And the long and short of it is you are some kind of a vagrant who moves to Los Angeles and tries to make it. And the way to make it is apparently to play one of these 3 pinball tables. I only got to the basketball pinball table section of the story mode. And there you're kind of like trying to earn money, make choices. You play the actual pinball game, but then you actually play an in-game, like a real basketball game, and it's just absolutely terrible. So I would skip this one. Back to the Japanese FMV genre, and we have Hokuto no Ken, or Fist of the North Star. And look, the FMV genre is, I think, it might be a nostalgic genre, but let's face it, the games weren't that good. In this case, I actually think this is a pretty good interactive movie. Hokuto no Ken is a really, I think, impressive anime, especially when you think that it came out in the 80s, incredibly violent, atmospheric. And this game kind of captures that. And hey, there's a huge language barrier here. But I think the images speak for themselves, especially if you've seen a little bit of the first episode of Hokuto no Ken, which I would recommend. And basically, you are experiencing scenes from that series, and your character is moving through the game world, and then you get into these one-on-one battles that I would say have kind of like a rock, paper, scissor type of effect to them. You're choosing different martial arts moves. I can't quite know which is which, but basically through trial and error, you figure out what moves are effective against which opponents. You beat your opponent, and then you move through another story section. So it's not thrilling, but I think it is a really strong piece of memorabilia for the series. And I actually found myself playing this for longer than I thought I would. So I think that's a testament to the quality of this game. And if you're at all a fan of the series, I might actually look at this. It's pretty cheap to import, and it might be interesting to you. I then found a copy of Assault Suit Lanos 2 for about $30, and I thought that was a reasonable deal. I had not played the series before, and quite frankly, it didn't strike me as my type of side-scrolling shooting game. I'm partial to things like Metal Slug, and this, for whatever reason, seemed a little too technical for my tastes. And I guess I was right about that, except for the fact that it's a really good game. It's interesting to see how far they pushed that genre here. So I played the first few stages and enjoyed it quite a bit. And considering I got it for what I think is a fairly decent price, I'm pretty happy with the pickup, and I intend to make my way through the game, hopefully in the coming weeks. And then closing things out on the Saturn, going back to the theme of these pickups, and that is another interactive movie game This is Street Fighter II, the movie. When I saw this on the shelf, I was initially thinking, oh, that's the sort of live motion capture Mortal Kombat style fighting game that I have heard is absolutely terrible. But that's not what this is. This is the interactive movie version of the Street Fighter II anime feature film, which is a really, really excellent film if you have not seen it and you're a Street Fighter fan. I remember watching that much later in life, maybe 5 years ago, and saying to myself, if I had seen this as a teenager, I would have absolutely lost it. I would have been head over heels, particularly with the Chun-Li and Vega fight scene. If you've seen it, you know what I mean. Anyway, this is ostensibly a game. I worked through the beginning of it, played it for about a half hour, I would say, or what seemed like a half hour, and there was no interactive element that I could tell or I could discern unless I missed some text that was telling me what to do. But it did sort of capture the feel and the fun of the movie since I had seen the movie, and I think the Saturn did a respectable job within its technical limitations of presenting the animation. So, again, I would label this a curiosity. I wouldn't go out and get this game. Again, I would rather watch the movie, and that's what I would recommend here. But since I've collected so many of the games that I want on the Saturn, this is one of the Capcom games that I didn't have, and I thought it was worth adding it to my collection. All right, we're going to bring the video to a close with the Switch pickup section. And Switch games in Japan, obviously, it's the popular console now. There are a ton of Switch games. Some are ones that we rarely see even on eBay here. But all right, so we're going to close things out with the Nintendo Switch. And the Switch, obviously an incredibly popular console. if you're in Japan looking for Switch games, you're not really going to find deals per se, although if you are shopping with US dollars, you can get some pretty decent discounts if you're over there. And the first game I picked up was the physical copy of Drainus. This is a Jay Shy pick, and I remember him telling me if I could get my hands on this, he believes it's going to be rare, and he also just recommended the game. He's right. It's a very good, very respectable side-scrolling shooter. A lot of fun, very approachable. I forgot that I had this on Steam, but still having the physical version is always a good thing. Next up is a game I was always curious about, and that is Momotaro Dentetsu World. This is a long-running series from Konami, and I remember reading an article about how this was one of the most played and most popular Switch games in Japan. Obviously, it's unique enough and culturally specific enough that it will not be localized here in the U.S., but I wanted to give it a shot, and basically from what I can tell, by the way, this is not a good game to import because there is a huge language barrier, but it is very similar to Itadaki Street. That came out over here as Fortune Street, which is a very good game. This is a little bit more complicated. It's almost as if they understood the popularity of that game and iterated upon it probably multiple times. But the game definitely has a charm. You're basically playing a type of Monopoly where you're traveling around the world, first by train, then by plane, making investments in various places. And I believe the objective is just to get the most money. So kind of like Itadaki Street, but from what I can tell, there's no competitive component where you're trying to like get your opponents to land on your properties. Again, as far as I can tell, I could be totally wrong about that. It seems like you land on a tile, each tile confers some kind of a bonus, and then you can make a purchase. Depending on where in the world you are, things are very expensive. But yeah, I think it would be fun to play a translation of this, but all I can say is I can see the charm, but would not suggest this as an import title. So me being me, I had to pick up a Mahjong game of some sort, and this is Ginsei Mahjong DX. And to my knowledge, it is the only new Mahjong game on the market, or at least that I could see in the Switch, PS5, PS4 sections. So I picked it up, and honestly, it's not a great Mahjong game. It seems to be much more geared towards education. For example, in the default sound settings, it will actually call out each tile. So it's a good way to learn the Japanese terms for each tile, learn the numbers and things like that. It also has an actual teaching section, but from what I can tell, those are just more or less slides of experts or hosts kind of picking, strategies that they want to show you at, of various levels of complexity. And then you kind of go into the game, and there are computer-controlled opponents who have different skill sets and who are more challenging, and then you kind of mix and match them and learn how to play. I believe there's an online section, but I don't have Nintendo Online, so I can't test that out. I had to buy it just because I love Mahjong video games, but it's honestly not that great. Then I picked up a shmup called Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid, and then it has some other titles that I don't understand. I believe I have this on the PlayStation 4, or a game in that series on the PlayStation 4. This is a competent shooter. You have three, I'll call them anime girls, three characters, and you share the same life bar. So you can take a good amount of hits, but once you exhaust the life bar, all three characters die and you have to start over. It's visually nice looking, but I feel like the cell shading just is a little off. Like it vacillates between looking pretty decent and then like you're playing an internet game or a flash game. Um, but it's always fun to collect shmups, and it's definitely not a bad example of the genre. So it wasn't that expensive either. It was, I think, in the 20-ish dollar range, perhaps a little less than $20. So I went with it, and I do intend to try to complete it at some point. Now, a much better shmup is Batsugun, and this was actually a game that I picked up simply because of the exchange rate advantage. I remember seeing this come out on PlayAsia, and I don't want to say I passed on it, but there were other games I wanted to buy. And then I believe Limited Run might have put out a version in the US. I definitely skipped that. But in this case, I think with the exchange rate, it was about $20 or just maybe like $18.90 or something like that. So for that price, I was all in, and this is an extremely fun game. I have not played it since the days of the Saturn, and it's a wonderful game. So this is definitely one where the Saturn game is super expensive now, but if you want to enjoy this game, again, incredibly well done. All sorts of different options and tweaks, so you can play the game the way you want it, which is absolutely what I look for in any game, but certainly in a shoot 'em up re-release. So very high recommendation. The next game really surprised me. This is Zoids, King of Blast. I want to say maybe the U.S. title was Wild Blast, something like that. But I know nothing about the property that this is based on. I'm assuming it's an anime. But the game was really surprising. It is a very polished fighting game, and it's very rare that you pick up a game on the Switch and you're impressed by it. You're like, oh, excellent graphics, smooth frame rate. Like it feels like a high quality product. Now, the fighting itself is a little on the basic side from what I can tell, but it doesn't limit the enjoyment. This is a game that I can definitely see myself playing. It has a nice pick up and play quality, and I think like from time to time, if I want to just have a little fun for a half hour, this is one of the games that I'm going to pop into the Switch. We have reached the final game in what has to be my longest pickups video ever. And I think we're just going to do a little contest. So if you've made it this far, in the description to this video, there's a link to my Discord. Click that link, join the Discord, and just say hi, and tell me what the last game is in this video. If you do that, I will send you a prize. And I've got a pretty decent prize to send out, actually. So what is this game? This is the Blaster Master Trilogy. And this was an interesting one because on the last night, my wife and I were in Bic Camera in Akihabara. And she said to me, you know what? Just to celebrate the end of a great trip, why don't you just pick something out? And then she went off, as she usually does, and goes into the toy section, the doll section, stuff like that. So I had free reign, and I was looking for a game, and it was just about as the store was going to close. So I was under some time pressure, and I was looking around, and Bic Camera was very interesting because they would label on each game which games were in English and other languages. So I saw that this was an English language game. I'm like, all right, time is ticking. Let me pick this one up. I'm going to be honest, I didn't know what this was. And it was only when I got home and put it in, I was like, oh, this is Blaster Master. I know a lot of people have nostalgia for the NES Blaster Master. I had never played that one. I had never played any of these games. And I have to say, it is pretty satisfying. The sort of tank mechanic and then jumping out and, getting through the kind of small openings as your little soldier guy, and then actually going in and playing kind of like overhead Zelda-style action stages. It really works. It's very much an NES game in the sense that it's pretty difficult, and you really need to identify patterns and work to beat each level. So you have to kind of be in that mindset. But like I said, it was a very fun game, and I think it's good to have the physical copy because if I'm not mistaken, this was a download-only game here in the U.S., at least for a while. I don't know if Limited Run or something has released the trilogy, but I think it's a nice box art as well. So that concludes my pickups in Japan. I have to say it was some amazing game hunting, and I can only hope to return and do some more. So just some final thoughts and takeaways from this trip. This trip was really meaningful to me because if you follow the channel from the beginning, Japan and import gaming and Japanese games have played such a major role in what I've discussed, but I never actually got to the country. And having been there and having experienced things and walking in places that I walked in the Yakuza games and just seeing the culture firsthand was something that is, I hate to say life-changing because it seems that I'm being melodramatic, but I really think it is. As somebody who was so fascinated with Japan for so long, to go to experience it and to kind of come back and look at the games that I have with that firsthand experience is something very special. I will say that I'm glad I did not only game hunt. I think it's important. Now, I've spent the past hour talking about all the cool games that I picked up, but the trip was so much more than just game hunting, and I would say if you go to Japan, don't go as a retro gamer, don't go as an influencer, go as a person who is open to learning about a new culture and just soak it in. And I started off thanking my wife, and I'll end thanking her because, again, this whole trip, she made it happen. I'm kind of a curmudgeon. I'm a guy who likes to kind of sit in the game room and relax, and the stresses of travel can get to me sometimes. But when you marry well and a person can kind of get you out of your shell a little bit, it is a magical thing. So I do thank her for the experience. I thank her for prying me out of the game room. And ultimately, the experiences that I've had here will enrich all the future hours that I spend in the game room, again, because I've experienced the culture firsthand, and I'm seeing these cultural artifacts now with new eyes, and that truly is a great gift.